Hey everyone, gather around. Come on in and make yourselves comfortable. Today I want to share a really incredible story with you. It's one of those epic tales passed down through the ages, whispered by the howling winds of the desert, and recorded in some of the oldest texts known to humanity. You know, as a teacher, there is absolutely nothing quite as thrilling as blowing the dust off an ancient mystery and examining the fascinating clues left behind. Think about this. If you were to travel to the western shore of the Dead Sea today, you'd be met with this harsh, almost alien, desolate beauty. It's a completely barren, salt-crusted landscape. The heat is incredibly oppressive, the earth is parched dry, and very, very little life can survive out there. But, according to the ancient narratives, it wasn't always this way at all. Today, we're going to look really closely at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we aren't just going to read it like a dusty old book. We're going to explore the modern-day archaeological claims presented by researchers Ron and Mary Nell Wyatt. They actually ventured right out into that desolate desert, seeking physical evidence of a world that once was. So, settle in, open your minds, and let's journey back thousands and thousands of years together.
Our story begins in a time of great ancient patriarchs, and specifically focuses on two men you might have heard of, Abraham and his nephew Lot. According to the biblical account, their flocks and herds had grown so absolutely immense that the land literally couldn't support both of them living side by side anymore. So to avoid any family strife, Abraham offered Lot the choice of where to settle his people. Lot looked out across the horizon and chose the plain of Jordan. The sources describe this area in the ancient past as incredibly lush, beautifully well-watered, and super prosperous. We're talking almost like a magnificent green garden right there in the Middle East. But you might be wondering, why was this specific plain so deeply coveted? Well, the researchers point out that the immense wealth of the cities situated there, particularly the famous cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, was likely fueled by natural slime pits. These were essentially ancient tar or bitumen seeps bubbling right up from the ground. Now back then, bitumen was incredibly valuable. It was the absolute essential mortar of the ancient world, used for all kinds of major construction and waterproofing. By controlling and selling this resource to the surrounding nations, these cities amassed just unimaginable wealth. They were rolling in it. Drawn by this glittering prosperity, Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom, completely and blissfully unaware of the dark and wicked events that the ancient texts say would very soon unfold.
You see, the ancient text tells us that the cities of the plain had fallen into deep corruption, arrogance, and just overwhelming wickedness. And the story takes a super dramatic and honestly terrifying turn when two angels, who simply appeared as ordinary travelers, visited Lot. Being a good host, he graciously took them into his home for the night to keep them safe. However, a hostile, angry crowd from the city quickly surrounded the house. Just imagine the absolute claustrophobia and the rising panic as this mob pressed right up against the walls, aggressively demanding that Lot bring his guests outside to them. It's a super intense scene. The researcher's account highlights a really fascinating supernatural detail right here. When the crowd grew violent and actually attempted to break down the door, the angels didn't just physically bar the way or fight them off. No, they struck the unruly men with a specific, profound kind of blindness. The ancient texts describe this not just as a simple loss of sight, like the lights going out, but as a deep, incredibly confusing mental disorientation. The mob became so hopelessly bewildered that they completely exhausted themselves, just blindly groping along the walls, literally unable to even locate the doorframe. Taking advantage of this, the angels urgently instructed Lot and his family to flee for their lives, warning them not to look back, and allowed them to escape to a small nearby city called Zoar, just before the impending doom fell upon the entire valley.
And the very second Lot was safely away, the ancient narrative describes a sudden, truly catastrophic destruction. The skies just opened up, and brimstone and fire rained down from heaven directly upon Sodom, Gomorrah, and all the surrounding plains. The story is absolute in its terrifying finality. We have to understand this was not merely a fire that burned the wooden beams of houses or sings the fields. The texts describe an event so unimaginably intense that it left everything in those prosperous plains completely and utterly annihilated. We're talking the grand architecture, the people, the massive herds of animals, all that lush green vegetation, the topsoil, and even the underlying solid bedrock itself, all of it utterly consumed by an unquenchable, terrifying inferno. For millennia, this sweeping destruction was widely considered just a moral allegory, a myth lost to the swirling sands of time. But that brings us right to the modern era of our story, where the claims of some truly startling physical evidence begin to surface.
Which brings us to uncovering this mystery, part 1 of the investigation, discovering the ash.
Okay, let's dive right into this and fast forward our story a few thousand years to the late 20th century. The year was 1989. Explorer Ron Wyatt was driving back and forth through the desolate rocky terrain near the western shore of the Dead Sea, just heading to other archaeological sites. But as he drove, something out the window caught his eye. He claimed to have stumbled upon these strange, whitish geometric formations standing in stark, bizarre contrast to the surrounding brown, natural rocky landscape. In fact, the road actually cut right through some of these formations. He stopped his vehicle, walked out into the arid heat, and realized these weren't just weird-looking rocks. They were immense heaps of white, powdery ash. As Wyatt and his team, including his wife Mary Nell, began to closely examine these ashen heaps, they observed distinct architectural anomalies that entirely defied natural geology. Years later, when Mary Nell used a drone, the aerial footage revealed what appeared to be communicating streets and pathways laid out with totally deliberate urban purpose. They found evidence of what looked exactly like Canaanite-style double walls. These were ancient defensive structures built with sharp 90-degree angles and stabilizing buttresses, perfectly mirroring the great fortresses of antiquity. They even claimed to find the layered remains of ancient ziggurats, massive step-like temple structures where the wooden interior supports had clearly burned away, leaving an outer shell. They documented towering sphinx-like shapes that traditionally stood as majestic guards at the entrances to ancient cities. Yet here is the craziest part. This entire complex wasn't made of stone or mud brick anymore. It was made of a powdery material that just crumbled like fine talcum powder right in their hands, miraculously maintaining the ghostly shapes of a once mighty, walled civilization.
But what could have possibly caused this absolute annihilation? The researchers claim the answer lies in spheres of pure sulfur.
So, in 1990, the story takes a truly fascinating turn. A year prior, Mary Nell had found a chunk of this strange ash that contained a really curious little cavity inside. She actually joked at the time that it looked like a vaporized eyeball. But upon returning to the site and searching much more closely, they discovered what had actually created those cavities. Embedded throughout the ashen ruins, literally peppered across the entire ghostly landscape, they found millions of perfectly round spheres tucked inside little crystalline capsules. Now, these weren't ordinary stones. They were balls of sulfur. The Bible explicitly states that God rained brimstone and fire. Well, if you open a dictionary right now and look up the word brimstone, it is defined precisely as sulfur. And sulfur is a really unique element. When it burns, it doesn't look like a regular campfire. It burns with a haunting blue flame at incredibly high temperatures. It also creates these suffocating sulfur dioxide fumes that aggressively displace the oxygen in the air. The researchers argue that the pattern of these spheres found embedded in the ash directly mirrors a heavy, rain-like pattern. They suggest these burning spheres literally plummeted from the sky, hitting the cities at irregular intervals and igniting the entire plain in an inescapable, choking firestorm.
Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is the science behind it. To verify exactly what they had found, Ron Wyatt took samples of these little yellow spheres to Galbraith Laboratories in Tennessee for rigorous testing. And the results? They were totally startling. The spheres were tested and found to be an incredibly high 95.72% pure sulfur. Now, you might wonder why that specific number is such a big deal. Well, naturally occurring geothermal sulfur, the kind you might find bubbling up near a volcano, is typically only about 40 to 60% pure, and it forms in irregular, jagged crystalline chunks. But these spheres? They were perfectly round, a shape that naturally forms only when a molten liquid falls to the atmosphere and cools on the way down. Furthermore, they weren't just pure, they actually contained specific trace metals, including phosphorus. And phosphorus would have acted as a chemical incendiary accelerant, making the fire even crazier. The researchers noted that they took these samples to highly trained geologists and even to the Smithsonian, and they claimed that sulfur of this unique, ultra-pure composition and perfectly round shape had never been found anywhere else on the face of the Earth.
And this brings us to the unimaginable conditions that actually created this ash, the extreme heat. We really have to understand how these sulfur spheres survived for nearly 4,000 years. I mean, think about it. If they burned an entire ancient metropolis to ash, why didn't they just burn themselves up entirely? The researchers' theory here is beautifully simple yet chemically profound. As these sulfur bombs rained down, they ignited absolutely everything they touched. The heat was so unimaginably intense that it vitrified the surrounding material. Vitrification means the heat literally melted the surrounding ash and turned it into a hard, glass-like crystalline shell right around the sphere. Once this hard capsule formed, it completely sealed off the outside oxygen supply. And, as we know, fire needs oxygen. So without it, the sulfur smothered itself out, perfectly preserving the unburned center of the sphere inside its protective casing for millennia, just waiting to be cracked open by curious explorers.
The sheer scale of the heat described in these claims is just staggering. We are talking about temperatures easily exceeding 2,000 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The researchers state that the fire was so insanely hot it penetrated and vaporized everything: stone, wood, metal, and tragically, the inhabitants. They even claim to have found vitrified gold at the site, gold that had been superheated and vaporized into crystal salts. Just think about the sheer, terrifying energy required to vaporize a heavy, precious metal like gold. When Wyatt asked the testing lab to perform a BTU test to determine just how hot these sulfur balls would burn, the lab actually refused. No way, they said. They stated the heat would be so intense it would permanently damage their robust stainless steel testing chamber.
To truly grasp the visual evidence left behind, I want to teach you a fascinating chemical concept that the sources bring up: thermal ionization. When you burn a regular campfire in your backyard, the resulting ash just sort of crumbles and falls into a flat gray pile, right? But what the researchers found at these desolate sites were massive walls of ash with distinct, beautiful swirling layers. They argue this is the direct result of thermal ionization. This occurs in a flash fire so blindingly hot, acting almost like a miniature nuclear reaction, that the actual elements of the burning structures are separated by their atomic weights. This unimaginable heat caused the melting, burning brick and stone to swirl like a fiery liquid vortex, and then freeze in time as it collapsed into ash. The researchers noted that this fire didn't just casually burn the surface, it burned completely and totally down to the very bedrock of the Earth, leaving behind these frozen, swirling layers as a permanent testament to its power.
And this brilliantly illustrates a huge puzzle in our story. If these cities were turned to ash roughly 3,900 years ago, why in the world didn't the ash just blow away in the harsh desert winds centuries ago? I mean, it's ash, right? Well, the researchers point to the pioneering work of an ancient French chemist named Lavoisier, who meticulously studied the principles of combustion. Lavoisier discovered that when materials are burned under normal conditions, the resulting ash is significantly lighter and flakier than the original material. That's why your campfire ash easily blows away on the blaze. However, when a material is burned specifically in the presence of sulfur, a totally unique chemical reaction occurs. The burning sulfur actually draws in extra molecules from the surrounding oxygen. Because of this added molecular weight, the resulting sulfur-burned ash is significantly heavier, denser, and way more compacted than the original unburned stone or mud brick. This crusty, compacted, unusually heavy ash is exactly what the Wyatts claim to have found, and it perfectly explains how these ghostly city outlines survived the relentless, howling winds of the desert over all those centuries.
Now, the timeline of our story doesn't actually end with the immediate destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you remember Lot? He initially fled to a smaller, fifth city nearby called Zoar. Well, the ancient texts tell us that sometime after Lot arrived, he was overcome with intense fear for his life there as well. He looked around and noted that the people of Zoar hadn't changed their ways at all, despite literally witnessing the apocalyptic destruction just across the valley. Driven by this profound terror, he and his daughters eventually fled Zoar to live completely isolated in a mountain cave. And according to Wyatt's claims, he actually located a fifth, smaller site nearby that perfectly aligns with this narrative. He believes it to be the remains of Zoar. It was a perfect rectangle of ash and ruins, peppered with the exact same unearthly sulfur balls, heavily implying that shortly after Lot's final fearful departure, Zoar too was consumed by the very same fiery, inescapable judgment.
And so after looking at all this evidence, we are left with a preserved warning, an ancient message frozen in time. As we draw this incredible story to a close, we really must look at the profound spiritual and historical conclusions drawn by the researchers. For Ron and Mary Nell Wyatt, these ashen heaps and embedded sulfur balls are not just weird geological oddities, nor are they merely the ruins of some ancient misfortune. They view them as a deliberate, intentional message left behind for humanity. The sources point directly to the ancient writings of 2 Peter, which explicitly state that the cities were turned to ashes as an ensample, an enduring visual example of what will happen to the wicked. The researchers firmly believe that a divine hand intentionally altered the very geology of the landscape. Not only were the cities burned with a uniquely heavy, unmovable ash, but a massive line of demarcation was drawn with unimaginable amounts of salt, creating the extreme, lifeless salinity of the Dead Sea region we see today. They believe this ensured the land would remain completely desolate and uninhabitable forever. The ruins, they argue, were perfectly preserved by divine intention, so that future generations, like us, could physically see the stark reality of the ancient texts and truly understand the profound consequences of a civilization turning entirely away from goodness and grace.
And so, my young friends and curious learners, our story for today concludes.
We have essentially walked the ghostly, ancient streets of heavy, compacted ash together. We've examined the claims of ultra-pure, unnaturally round sulfur spheres raining straight from the sky, and we've explored the breathtaking science of thermal ionization, freezing swirling stone in time. Whether you view this as a literal, historical event backed by modern archaeological discovery, or as a profound ancient narrative meant to guide human morality, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah continues to absolutely capture the human imagination. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as you go about your day. When we look back at the ruins of history, at the heavy ashes of the plain preserved through millennia, what wisdom will you take away for your own life? Thank you so much for gathering around to listen, and please, always keep seeking the truth hidden in the stories of old.